For many, the issue of prisoners' rights is out of sight, out of mind. But a recent hunger strike of nearly 30,000 California inmates drew international attention to the condition of America's prisons. The prisoners, who began striking in July, banded together to call for an end to the use of extended solitary confinement, a practice which many human rights groups have likened to torture. Now, after 2 months of hunger striking, the prisoners ended the protest to accept the promise of legislative hearings on the matter. But the use of solitary is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to America's incarceration machine. This country has only 5% of the world's population, yet holds 25% of the world's prisoners, according to the NAACP. Joining me now to discuss how it got to be this way is Eugene Puryear, author of Shackled and Chained, Mass Incarceration in Capitalist America. Thank you so much for coming on, Eugene.
No, thank you so much for having me.
Always a pleasure. Eugene, I wanted to show this chart to our audience showing that no country incarcerates a higher percentage of its population than the U.S. What is the main factor behind this shocking statistic?
Well, I think the main factor behind this massive growth we've seen in the U.S. prison population, what's come to be known as mass incarceration, is really in the context of the development of U.S. capitalism. Ultimately, it was a surplus population problem. What you have is, if we see the post-World War II period in the United States was a period of so-called rising prosperity, it created amongst people this feeling that life should continue to always get better, living standards should get higher. The Civil Rights Movement raised a similar sort of expectation among black Americans that they would be integrated into this quote-unquote American dream. But what we saw with the economic crisis of the 1970s is not just a general rightward shift in the country, but a decision that social services and jobs programs and creating jobs for people would go by the wayside, which created, with the rise of technology as well, this issue of what are you going to do with this growing number of unemployed and underemployed people, particularly those concentrated in the ghettos, as it were, the people of color, black Americans, who have a traditional revolutionary sort of rebellious legacy in the history of the country. And that sort of confluence came together to create the policies of mass incarceration as we know them. Of course, the drug war would come a little bit later, providing a crucial fuel to that fire.
Well, it's funny, I've heard people joke about how they need to go to prison in order to get health care and services, Eugene, so it's just a really sad state of affairs. Your book talks about the horrible conditions in these prisons. You've likened them to actual torture chambers. What do you mean by that? Well,
I mean, it's an interesting point. I mean, you pointed out, for example, the California prison strike. Pelican Bay has 500 people who have been in solitary confinement for over 10 years. Now, the Council of Europe in 2011 said that anything over 14 days in solitary confinement should be considered injurious. And so that's just one example, 25,000 people being held under solitary confinement, but everything from generalized overcrowding with the federal prison system, roughly 36% overcapacity, to food cost. For example, in 2001, the U.S. government estimated that people spend about $8 a day on food. Now, the year after that, the state of California was spending roughly $2 a day on food per prisoner. So we can see in a large degree, and whether it is access to health care, access to mental health, and all these other things that exist, the situation in prisons is quite dire.
Indeed. One thing that I thought was really fascinating that you point out is that a lot of these prisoners, an overwhelming majority, in fact, don't have a trial by jury, a fair one. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, you've got about 80% of people who end up in prison who never even really had a trial. And I think there's a lot of things about that. I mean, obviously, recently what we've seen is cuts to public defender services happening all across the country and in the federal public defender service. But beyond that, things like these draconian sentences that exist under mandatory sentencing laws in so many different states and on the federal level create a situation where people don't want to even take the chance of going to trial rather than going to prison because they feel that because of their legal counsel or the way the laws are written, that they have absolutely no chance. And so we see that the deck is kind of stacked against people really from Jump Street when it comes to a criminal trial.
You bring up a good point, which is these minimum sentencing. Considering the massive overcrowding that we're seeing in prisons today, why are these laws still in effect, like the 3 strikes law?
Well, I mean, one good thing is that we're seeing that that's starting to move by the wayside, but the real reason is because this issue of mass incarceration as a policy view has not really fully come around. I mean, you saw in the 1980s when Reagan came in, the first thing he did is he put in, well, not the very first thing, one of the first things he did was put together an attorney general's task force, which stated that the most important issue when it came to criminal justice in America was the need to have more prison beds. And this sort of punitive, law and order, mass incarceration set of policies is still how a wide variety of the political and economic elites view the issue of crime and how it should be dealt with.
Eugene, right now, an African-American male who doesn't have a high school diploma is more likely to end up in prison than with a job. Really sad. Why is the justice system so disproportionately skewed against minorities?
Well, I think it goes back to the original point I made about sort of the surplus population problem and the fact that the African-American community is really the most oppressed community in this country and is sort of the furthest outside of the quote-unquote mainstream when it comes to employment and all of these other wealth-building type issues and indicators, education, and so on and so forth. So the laws that have existed to create mass incarceration have been aimed disproportionately at those to where African Americans are overrepresented. Ultimately, that's what it comes down to, and we see that it plays out sort of on that structural level. And also, you know, for example, 71% of black men who are convicted of drug crimes end up in prison, as opposed to 63% of white men. Now that could, you know, reflect a number of different things, but I think it certainly reflects the biases of the judges, the biases of the juries, and so on and so forth. So really, from its very inception, this issue of how to deal with mass incarceration was how to deal essentially with the problems in the quote-unquote ghetto, the perception that crime is mostly black people, mostly poor black people, and they live in certain neighborhoods. How do we control them? How do we make our police and prison policies match up with our need to not help these people, not give them jobs, not give them health care, not improve their situation, but just deal with them? So we'll find a way to throw them in prison and make these laws.
Well, it's such a superficially and just racist argument to say that that's, you know, they're inherently more criminal. Obviously, when you look at the conviction rates of the same exact crimes, white versus black, it's very apparent what's going on here. You talked about the drug war very briefly. I wanted you to elaborate on how much of this really has to do with the drug war.
Well, I think quite a bit. I mean, a quarter of prisoners in this country are convicted of drugs. But I think what's important to realize is when mass incarceration policies first came in, I mentioned Reagan's report, you didn't have the crack boom that would later happen in the 80s. And so what the crack epidemic in particular did in giving an acceleration to the war on drugs was provide this kindling to the fire. So things like mandatory sentencing, which notably Joe Biden and other Democrats like Ted Kennedy, so-called liberals, were key in bringing in. These sort of things that before people were a little skeptical about. When crack starts to happen, when Lynn Bias died of a cocaine overdose, you start to see that as an impetus to bring in things like three-strike laws and other mass incarceration policies that might have been a little bit on the fringe in the early 80s, late 70s, but then because of the crack epidemic, they were able to push these punitive policies very heavily on the state and federal level.
Well, let's talk about private prisons, which is something that's expanding greatly in this country. The whole argument that we hear is that privatization will obviously lead to better conditions for prisoners, less of a burden for the taxpayers. Of course, what's your response?
Well, I would say that, you know, it's not borne out by the facts. I mean, one thing that we point out in the book, which people can get at shackledandchained.com, is this massive growth just since 1995 in private prisons. I mean, obviously what we've seen through all the studies is there's no evidence whatsoever that private prisons cost less. In a number of cases, they turn out to cost more or to create scandals that are so bad that they're not worth the issue. In so many different ways, they turn out to be more brutal. And also, you know, the whole idea that people have to be incarcerated for profit. I mean, I think 65% of private prisons, the contracts they sign require states and localities to put a certain number of people in the prison for, you know, the period of the contract. So ultimately, they're not concerned with corrective activities, rehabilitation, or anything like that, just getting as many people in the door as they possibly can and locking them up for profit.
Yes, it's been also revealed that, you know, payoffs from people who are putting people in prison get a cutback from these private prisons. It's just really shocking how kind of openly corrupt it is. Let's talk about the Corrections Corporation of America, the umbrella company that's kind of taking over this prison industry for profit. How have they exploited prison labor for their own advantage? Well,
CCA, Geo Group, all of them, I mean, the federal prisons, they're now exploiting prison labor in a big way, and it's sort of creating a new dynamic. I mentioned the issue of social control and excess population, but now you have this whole new billion-dollar industry that's looking to use prisoners to exploit them, and we see it whether they have them doing farm labor, working for 800 companies, taking reservations for things like American Airlines, wrapping Nintendo games. I mean, almost anything you can think of, these prisons, both private and public, are putting prisoners to work for extremely low wages. The federal prison industry, Unicor, and those are the people who make military uniforms and repair Humvees that are destroyed in Afghanistan. The average, highest average salary for people working at Unicor is less than $1.50 per hour, which just shows the high level of almost slave-type wages, sweatshop wages, no doubt, that are happening in prisons. And it's the biggest Fortune 500 companies, like I said, American Airlines, Bank of America, Nintendo, they're all involved in this.
Wow, so really it's just modern-day slavery. I mean,
without
pennies
a doubt.
on the dollar.
Oh, without a doubt.
You know, I thought that they were only making license plates until I heard that BP actually had outsourced prison labor to stage these photo ops of cleanups on the beach, and I just couldn't believe that that was happening. You know, it's interesting, Eugene, we repeatedly hear that the reason top bankers can't be prosecuted is because of the devastating effect that would have on the communities, the company. Why is that same standard not applied to entire communities that are inflicted and destroyed by mass incarceration policies?
Well, I mean, you know, it's a great point. I mean, it was unbelievable to hear Eric Holder say that people, you know, people who've been convicted of crimes in the economic crisis and of laundering drug money were too big to jail. I think it just shows the reality of this system, that it's a system that's skewed towards the richest people, the 1%, if you will, the financial elites, the ruling class, and not the poorest, most oppressed people, so that, you know, those who are considered the job creators and so on and so forth are able to live this gilded lifestyle and sort of fly above all of the double standards that are put out there. And those who are at the lowest end of the totem pole are the ones who become really the butt of society, those who have to put up with the worst forms of oppression, living standard exploitation, and the fact that they will put millions and millions of people in oppressed black communities in jail, absolutely destroy so many of these communities, and then do basically nothing towards Wall Street bankers is a clear indicator of what the priorities of our society really are.
Indeed. We have about 30 seconds left, but please tell people where they can find your book and find out more about this issue.
Of course. So people can check the book out at www.shackledandchained.com. They can also follow me on Twitter at Eugene Puryear. I also write for Liberation News at liberationnews.org. You can see some of my writings on this and other issues.
Excellent work. Eugene Puryear, author of Shackled and Chained: Mass Incarceration in Capitalist America. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.